All right. Today I'm going to deliver the lecture that I planned to give on Thursday. So I will not be surprised if some of you have not done the reading for this lecture yet. It is on the syllabus for Thursday rather than for today. But since we are not meeting on Thursday, it seemed to me the best thing to do was go ahead and give this lecture. It is tangentially about some of the things that we brought up earlier in the semester, but not very much, or rather this is taking it further than we have thus far. I want to talk about markets and ecosystem services. Those ideas pick up on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, obviously, which we have discussed. But I want to take this a lot further today. I want to talk about natural capital, sustainable development, and so-called green governance. I guess I would start by suggesting that these are ideas that are extremely current right now. If there is any single dominant way in which the sort of community of people interested in these issues and the institutions that they're affiliated with are pursuing these questions right now, this is it. Okay? So you will, if you go looking for it, you will find endless amounts of information, recent information about ecosystem services and ways of making them work with markets as a strategy towards sustainable development and more sustainable economic, social systems in general. There is a tremendous amount of research going on in the field of ecology, for example, and biology, trying to pin down exactly what these ecosystem services are, how we should measure them, how we can manage them, how we can create market incentives to improve their management. Okay? And I want to talk today largely about Robert Costanza's work. He is a very prominent environmental economist, ecological economist, who is sort of at the forefront of these ideas, has been for quite some time. I asked you, or for Thursday, I asked you to read several of his articles going back as far as 1992 and as recently as just last year. And I want to talk a little bit, I want to look a little bit at the way his thinking appears to have evolved over time and ask some questions about how this works, what it might be able to do, what it might not be able to do. So let's start by reviewing a couple of points from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. On page 6 of the summary that I asked you to read, they wrote, most resource management decisions are most strongly influenced by ecosystem services entering markets. As a result, the non-marketed benefits are often lost or degraded. These non-marketed benefits are often high and sometimes more valuable than the marketed ones. We have a sort of candid statement, assessment, that the issue of markets is extremely important, perhaps the most important consideration in thinking about these issues from the perspective of the assessment. And trying to understand the relationship of marketed to non-marketed benefits and the ways in which in getting ecosystem services into markets or having markets take advantage of ecosystem services strongly influences how those services and systems are managed, and that this can be key to their degradation. And the example that I showed before, and here it is again, a graph depicting the annual flow of benefits from forests in selected countries in Africa and Europe. We see they've got them broken down. On the left-hand side, you have economically valued uses of forests, and specifically grazing and timber and fuel wood. In the right-hand column in each country, you have non-marketed and other economic values from these same forests, broken down into carbon sequestration, watershed protection, non-timber forest products, and recreation and hunting. And this is an effort to depict the relative importance of these different kinds of values from forests in these different countries. And the point they want to drive home is that in several cases, Portugal, Italy, and Syria, the non-marketed benefits column is significantly higher, or the bar is significantly taller than the bar made up of the marketed benefits. And the idea here, obviously, is perhaps these systems should not be used for these marketed values of timber, fuel wood, and grazing if doing so impairs the other values, the non-marketed values, the carbon sequestration, watershed, non-timber forests, recreation, and hunting values. Some of those values have got some kind of market expression, right? Recreation generates economic activity that we can measure. Carbon sequestration has begun to be valued this way in Europe. Yes?
How do you have a negative recreation value?
How do you have a negative recreation value? How would that make sense? What I want to say offhand is that they are lost. In other words, if you cut down the forest, you lose the carbon sequestration value, the pink. And perhaps you lose some of the recreation and hunting values. It's interesting that they would choose to do it in that way, though, because they don't do it that way here. Any thoughts, other questions? Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah?
But if you cut down the trees from this area or something, you might actually get more recreational benefits of doing that than having forest there.
Still not clear why you would then column that or measure that negatively, right?
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? This is a good question for going back to the assessment and digging into it further. The point that they're trying to illustrate here, obviously, is simply that the non-marketed values can exceed the marketed values. And that, therefore, there's some question about the wisdom of marketing the values that are marketed, right? But that's a good question about the negative, because it comes up in several places here. Let me think about that. It's also not clear why the timber value here would be negative, unless somehow it's been lost. Perhaps? Anybody interested in following that up further? I would volunteer to do it, but I don't know if I'll have the time. Yes? That's possible, yes. It's possible that grazing land in Algeria has entrained deforestation, which has reduced timber value. If someone cares to try to pull it up right away, there's probably a long footnote annotation to this graph that would answer this question for us. All right. Maybe you can come back to us with that in a few minutes. Okay, thank you. Okay, one of the readings that I asked you to do is a famous and perhaps infamous article from 1997, for which Robert Costanza was the lead author. There were, like, I think 11 other authors on this effort. It was a major paper, and it attempted to provide a number, a quantitative measure of the value of the world's ecosystem services, all of them, at a global scale. And they write, a large part of the contribution to human welfare by ecosystem services are of a purely public goods nature. They accrue directly to humans without passing through the money economy at all. In many cases, people are not even aware of them. It's interesting, if you read the opening paragraphs of that article, that they openly admit that what they are attempting to do, what they are presenting in this article, is problematic. Anybody? How many of you have actually done the reading for Thursday already? A couple of you. Do you recall some of the reasons they suggested that this is problematic? Why might it be problematic to attempt to put a dollar figure, a price, on the value of the world's ecosystem services if they are of this kind, right? They don't pass through the money economy at all. In many cases, people are not even aware of them. What might be some problems with this undertaking? Yeah. Okay, there are a lot of different ways that people value things. There's a methodological problem. Exactly what kind of price do you put on something for its aesthetic value? Is there a single measure? There might be some people who value things much more highly than other people do. Methodologically, this paper is, very much sort of pushing the limits of the available methods for trying to measure these things. Yeah. Okay, there are also some serious ethical questions at stake here. What do you achieve by putting a price tag on these things? And are there potential downsides to putting a price on these things? Does it draw attention that might lead to activities that in fact try to capitalize on this value in some fashion? And is that necessarily a good idea? Even if it means some people get to capitalize and profit, does it run the risk of privatizing things, making them no longer public goods? And that might alter their distribution. It might also alter their quality. Yeah.
In the complex simplistic ecological system, in order to create multiple values to services get divided into parts, they don't necessarily have clear dividend lines.
Okay, if you're talking about a complex system, a complex ecological system, there are lots and lots and lots of parts and lots of interactions, and the effort to put a price on those systems, or rather on the services that those systems provide, necessarily involves a great deal of simplification, right? It means that you're going to take a huge coastal ecosystem, for example, and you're going to say, well, what we value here are the fish in it and maybe one or two other things that you can identify, whether it's storm protection or something like that, and we're going to price those things in abstraction from the more complicated whole that produces those services. And there are some questions, some serious questions, about whether that essentially does violence to the complexity of the system, right? And there's a well-established literature calling into question the wisdom of that kind of move, right? There are many, many, many examples where efforts to manage a system, a complex system, for one or two or three discrete things leads to a simplification of the system that has negative downstream effects. One of the great examples that's offered is efforts to control flooding along rivers by installing various kinds of dams and levees and so forth, which allows you to take advantage of floodplain land and develop it and do a variety of things. It might also facilitate navigation, allow you to do a lot of shipping up and down that river. It sort of takes the flooding problem out of a variety of economic activities, which is economically beneficial for those activities. But down the road, what that means is that you have altered the flood regime of that system, and it also has meant in many occasions that once a big enough flood comes along, you actually have exposed the system to a greater amount of damage than would have occurred otherwise. You'll get all kinds of flood impacts that are enormous and much larger than would have been the case in the absence of those modifications. Yeah?
We know very little about some environments, and so we might greatly undervalue the value of the ecosystem service because we just haven't found out more about that.
Okay, that is also true. There are a lot of things we don't understand about ecosystems and ecology, and we may not yet really have the information necessary to make a comprehensive assessment of the value of those systems and services that they provide. The classic example that's most frequently invoked here is the value of the genetic diversity of the plants and animals and other organisms in a given system, many, many, many of which have not even been described and cataloged, let alone tested to determine if they have any kind of valuable uses for us. And we certainly can't know ahead of time what those uses might be, how valuable they might be, or even when or if we may even discover them. So there are severe methodological and also more philosophical and ethical issues involved in any kind of undertaking like this. And this is why this paper is both famous and infamous. It provoked a great deal of controversy and debate. What do the authors of the paper ultimately offer as their rationale for doing this? It's interesting how they put it. They basically say, we recognize all these problems, and we understand that this might be deeply flawed, and we appreciate those criticisms, but they more or less say, we don't think we have any choice. They more or less say, we have to do this because this is the way the world can be expected to look at these systems, and we need, in other words, we want to put a price on the value of these ecological services precisely because they are so valuable and they are so overlooked and neglected. And part of why they're overlooked and neglected is precisely that they don't have a price, and therefore the world's investors and governments and so on don't recognize the importance of these systems. And we hope that by putting a price on them, we will raise awareness of the value of these systems and compel or persuade the sort of powerful interests of the world to pay attention to them in a new way. In a sense, they say, no matter how problematic this is, we don't really feel like there's any alternative. Not doing it is worse than doing it, is essentially what it comes down to. Which is not to say that that argument has persuaded a lot of their critics. A lot of people still feel like this was a flaw, or a mistake, or unwise in some way. On the other hand, it might well be the case that had they not done it, somebody else would have. And it does look as though, given how much this kind of approach has grown in the 13 years since they published this paper, you got to give them at least a little bit of what? You got to give them a little bit of that argument, that this is sort of a way of thinking that is much larger than just the 12 authors on this paper, and has become so prevalent that you sort of can't avoid it. So how might we think about this? And these are perhaps some somewhat simplified diagrams, but let's think of it this way for a moment. You might say that there is this much larger realm or set of all ecosystem services and products. And a portion of them are marketed. A portion of them actually become commodities and are the object of market transactions. And a whole bunch of them are not. And they're trying to draw our attention to the fact that this bigger circle is important, even if it's not yet marketed or not priced, and therefore sometimes overlooked. So the question becomes, what's the relationship here? How do they interact? What's the relative size of that market circle compared to the ecosystem services and product circle, that kind of thing. And in a lot of ways, what they're doing is trying to work across, find some common language that applies to all of this area, rather than just the market. So what are some of these relationships between markets and ecosystems? To some degree, this is reiterating some points made in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, right? Ecosystems can produce discrete products like fish, which are already commodities and have prices and are therefore easily measured in that way. Ecosystems can generate supplies such as water. Those can also be priced, although it's frequently more difficult. Ecosystems can enable production. And here we might think about photosynthesis, or pollination is a more frequently invoked example, where you have essentially wild insects and perhaps also birds that perform pollination for agricultural crops and are therefore absolutely necessary to those crops, but aren't the object of investment. The example is weakened somewhat by the fact that in a lot of modern systems, they are in fact part of an intentional economic activity. People keep bees and deliver them to fields on contract to provide pollination services to the farmers who pay them for this. On the other hand, that is perhaps an example in which the natural system has failed to do the job or has broken down in some fashion, and it's being substituted by intentional human activity with potentially deleterious consequences down the road, but that's a bigger story. The ecosystem can be an object of appreciation with derivative economic values, such as ecotourism, scenic vistas, the increment of value for home sites with really nice views, that sort of thing, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with, right? And economists can compare the market value of a home site with a view to another home site that's basically similar but lacks the view, and subtract to find the value attributable to the view. And this can become a way of measuring the ecosystem service of scenery, or you can tabulate the economic activity associated with a park, that kind of thing. Ecosystems absorb byproducts or threats. They absorb pollution. They reduce the threat of storms, for example. So mangrove swamps along coasts can greatly reduce the tidal surges associated with storms, which in turn, again, can be used as a way of trying to calculate the value of the mangrove swamp, insofar as you can look at the value of the real estate that's protected, you can look at the damage associated with different storms, and you can come up with figures about the economic value of the mangrove swamp in preventing storm damage. And finally, ecosystems can act as background conditions that in some ways facilitate production, and in other cases, or in other ways, threaten production. And climate is perhaps the best example. Simply the fact that the sun shines and there's a certain temperature makes certain kinds of crops possible, also facilitates certain kinds of tourism, that sort of thing. If you mess with the system in some fashion through climate change, you run the risk of imposing costs related to either change in the agricultural conditions or damage to investments. And again, there's another way of trying to put a price on these things. Yes?
Hasn't also with ecotourism, the market been able to use ecotourism to actually conserve some of our, like natural reserves and stuff like that, or natural reserves, for example, like the Great Barrier Reef shark in, Australia.
So
which is, say it's threatened.
The question is, haven't parks and protected areas actually facilitated certain kinds of economic activity, or the economic value of parks and ecotourism have been used to justify setting places aside for certain kinds of protection?
That's how we've done it, is through the market has come out.
There's a lot of examples. It's frequently used. Setting aside parks and things like that is frequently, one of the arguments made in favor of them is precisely that they are a way of encouraging certain kinds of economic development, often related to tourism. And it's true that the tourism associated with certain protected areas is an enormous part of the economic activity of certain parts of the world. It is the single largest industry in the world, right? Tourism, not just ecotourism, but tourism. And your question that relates to this one in particular?
Right. Well, it was just more about how like the market drivers can, conserve.
Right. On the one hand, that is a market-based or economic-based argument for these areas. On the other hand, most of those areas were set aside by simple political acts, right? That created certain kinds of ownership and protection and so forth. And that part isn't necessarily an economic trigger. Is that what you're getting at or not? Okay. Yeah.
Beyond that, like the benefits of the ecosystem doing that are questionable, given the fact that beyond the modification of the ecosystem, can also often entails the changing of ecological systems, the process setting aside.
Okay. Okay. Yes, it's certainly true that setting places aside for protection in the name of their environmental qualities or values can alter those systems in ways that might in fact undermine those values potentially. And there are plenty of examples in which setting aside a park has meant removing the people there, and the people there actually did things to those systems that contributed to the very values that drew the attention of the outside world to them in the first place. I'm not sure whether I don't think that enters into Costanza at all, thinking about how to value these systems. There are some, you'll notice that this list of 6 different ways of thinking about the value of ecosystems, and it's hardly comprehensive, already involves combining a lot of different methods, right? A lot of different tools. The first one is pretty straightforward. But as you work your way down the list, you've got to do more and more sort of statistical gymnastics to arrive at some kind of number. And the quality of those numbers from any methodological point of view is highly varied, to say the least, right? Some of the ways of measuring the value of ecotourism, for example, or recreation, involve asking people what they would pay for something. And then or asking them if they would pay X. And then you ask them, you ask 100 people and X is a different number, and you try to figure it out that way. And obviously there's no way to do that without it being affected by the amount of money that those people have. So the example I like to use is the fact that apparently a fish for an angler in California is worth a lot more than a fish for an angler in Iowa, which strikes me as having something to do with the differences in the incomes of anglers in California and Iowa rather than the differences in the fish, right? Any other questions about this? Yeah. The distinction between services and functions. Can you elaborate further on how he chooses to make that distinction?
Saying that photosynthesis serves as an environmental function, where having soil is a service. It actually is a process rather than just a component.
Huh. And this bears on the question of how you might measure their value. Right. Yeah. I suspect that the distinction, in the case of photosynthesis, it's rather difficult to decide what the value of photosynthesis is. Right. It's an ecological function, certainly.